The Galactic Council had always known humans were a problem. An entertaining problem, sure, but a problem nonetheless. They were unpredictable, absurdly creative, and operated with a level of reckless confidence that suggested they'd never actually read their own mortality statistics. So when a deep space probe picked up a human distress signal in uncharted space, specifically in the most aggressively uninhabitable sector of the known galaxy, the Council's first reaction was not concern, but deep, exhausted sighing. The transmission was garbled, old, but unmistakably human. Some poor idiot had gotten lost out there, which was, in itself, a mystery. That region wasn't just a bad neighborhood. It was the cosmic equivalent of an abandoned amusement park, where the rides still turn on by themselves, and every sign has the words "missing persons" stamped all over it. Even the most hardened species avoided it. Yet somehow, somewhere, a human was out there, alive, or had been. And the worst part? It was recent. High Chancellor Vorax, an 8-limbed, caffeine-dependent diplomat who had way too much on his plate already, pinched the bridge of his forehead cluster and groaned. "Tell me it's a hoax." The communications officer didn't even try to sugarcoat it. "It's legit." A heavy silence settled over the chamber, then, as if the universe had been waiting for the exact moment to ruin their week. Another alert flashed on the screen. More signals, more human activity, and this time, they weren't alone. "That's a war fleet," someone croaked. "That's a full human war fleet." "No, that's worse," Vorax corrected, his mandibles clicking anxiously. "That's an angry human war fleet." And that was the moment when the Council realized two horrifying truths. 1. Humans had survived whatever nightmare existed in the dead sector. 2. They were coming back. The chamber erupted into absolute chaos. "We need to establish communication," one official shouted. "We need to evacuate the border colonies," another shrieked. "We need to update the survival manual, because whatever let the humans survive out there is now following them home," an intern mumbled, staring at the display in abject horror. Vorax had already made his decision. "Send a diplomatic vessel," he ordered. "I don't care if it's the fastest ship we have. Get it out there now. We need to know what the hell happened out there before humanity decides we're next." But deep down, he knew. This wasn't a rescue mission. This wasn't a search and recover. This was a warning. Because whatever the humans had found out there, it had changed them. And if history had taught the galaxy anything, it was that a changed human was a dangerous human. The Galactic Council had seen bad days before: trade wars, failed peace talks, the occasional pirate insurrection. But today? Today was a different kind of bad. The kind of bad that made even the most self-assured bureaucrat rethink all their life choices, starting with their decision to show up to work that morning. The council chamber, usually a place of drawn-out debates over tariffs and mining rights, was now flooded with panicked voices as screens lit up with warnings in every major galactic language. Unidentified fleet detected. Extreme velocity. Direct course for the core systems. The security feed flickered, struggling to process what it was seeing, and then stabilized, revealing a sight that no one in that room would ever forget. A fleet. No, the fleet. Unmistakable, massive, and so blatantly human in design that it made even the most skeptical diplomats nearly void their digestive tracts on the spot. The ships were unlike anything recorded in modern history, yet unmistakably Terran, angular, brutalist, built for function over form. Matte black hulls, no identifying markings, no broadcasted IFF signals. They weren't coming to talk. They weren't coming to negotiate. They weren't even bothering to announce their return. The Zalari Chancellor's throat clicked in an involuntary gulp. "This must be a mistake," he stammered, his voice a weak attempt at optimism. "Perhaps a lost fleet, some fringe colony." His words died as the lead ship came into full view on the screen, its name written in bold, defiant human script across the hull. ESS Retribution. The room went silent. No one moved, no one breathed, because they all knew what that name meant. And worse, they knew what was coming next. The comms officer, trembling, activated the emergency diplomatic channel, broadcasting in every frequency known to civilized space. "Unidentified fleet, this is the Zalari High Council," he began, voice cracking like dry parchment. You are entering protected core space. Identify yourselves immediately, state your purpose, and the message cut out, not by jamming or interference, but by deliberate override. A new voice filled the chamber, deep, calm, and laced with something that sent a shiver through every being present. Not anger, not vengeance, certainty. We are humanity, the voice declared, each word delivered with the weight of an executioner's axe. And we have come to collect. Silence. Then, as if the galaxy itself had taken a deep breath in anticipation, the first shots were fired. The council chamber's main viewport lit up with a sight that no one, no historian, no war strategist, no military tactician, had ever prepared for. The human fleet didn't attack. They executed. Entire defense stations were deleted in microseconds, not bombed, not invaded, just turned off. One moment, they were there. The next, they were gone, as if some cosmic hand had simply reached into the void and plucked them from reality. Planetary shields, once considered impenetrable, flickered out like cheap discount lighting. The most advanced warships the Zilari had built were dead in space before their captains could even react, their systems hijacked, overridden, and forcefully shut down like an unpaid streaming subscription. This isn't possible, one of the counselors whispered, clutching at his chest as he watched their entire naval infrastructure collapse in real time. They shouldn't even exist. The transmission returned, but this time it wasn't just audio. A face, human, cold, unflinching. The kind of expression worn by someone who wasn't here for revenge, but for justice. You took everything from us, the human commander stated, voice devoid of any emotion. You signed our death warrant over a trade dispute. You erased our history, our homes, our people. You thought we were gone. He leaned in, his expression hardening into something that sent a primal, ancient terror through the council members' bones. You were wrong. The transmission cut, and with it, the first planet in the core systems went dark. No explosions, no screams, just silence. The kind of silence that precedes a storm that no one, not even the gods, could stop. The galaxy had long since forgotten what true fear felt like. Sure, there had been skirmishes, pirates harassing shipping lanes, the occasional interstellar war that ended in a few thousand casualties, maybe a planet-wide siege if someone really wanted to make a statement. But nothing had ever prepared them for this. The human fleet moved with surgical precision, not an invading force, not conquerors, executioners. There were no drawn-out battles, no chaotic dogfights, no desperate last stands. Just deactivation. Planets went dark, not bombed, not glassed, turned off. Like someone had simply yanked the power cord from an entire world and left it in the abyss. The orbital defenses of the Zilari homeworld barely had time to register a threat before their systems were rewritten, overwritten, and then erased like an embarrassing search history. 1 second, they were scanning the incoming ships, preparing firing solutions. The next, nothing. Their reactors went cold, their weapons were inert. Their mighty fleets, once the envy of the galaxy, drifted powerless like forgotten relics of a past age. And still, humanity said nothing. No declarations of war, no demands, no ultimatums, just consequences. In the Galactic Council chambers, the air was thick with something ancient, something primal. Dread. The Zilari Chancellor, once a smug, self-assured ruler of one of the most powerful civilizations in existence, was sweating. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of his console, watching as system after system went silent, entire colonies blinking out of existence like they had never been there to begin with. "Open a channel," he gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Open a damn channel." The comms officer's hands shook as he obeyed, rerouting what little remained of their communication network to a single desperate hail. "Humans," the Chancellor began, forcing a smile that even he didn't believe. "There has been some kind of misunderstanding." The reply was instant, cold, efficient. "No," the voice said, sharp as a knife. One word, one syllable. The most brutal rejection in history. The Chancellor's mouth went dry. There must be terms. There must be a way to—" "No," the human interrupted. voice devoid of emotion, absent of anger, lacking the cruelty the Zalari were expecting. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't some petty blood feud. This was protocol. The Chancellor's eyes darted back to the main display, where the last of their outer colonies went dark, the vast cityscapes of his people reduced to cold, dead silence. "Please," he whispered now, no longer a ruler, no longer a politician, just a desperate creature clinging to survival. "What do you want?" For the first time since the signal was established, the human hesitated. Then, in a voice so calm it was horrifying, they spoke. "You were warned." The channel cut. Across the council chamber, an eerie quiet settled, broken only by the ragged breathing of a civilization realizing far too late that they weren't negotiating anymore. They were begging. The Zalari homeworld was silent. Not the eerie, tense kind of silence before a battle, not the kind of silence that accompanies last-minute diplomacy. This was the silence of inevitability, of a species that had ruled for millennia, now staring at their own expiration date ticking down with every passing second. High command was frozen in place, staring at the message on the screen. Forced extinction or forced relocation. They weren't even negotiating terms. They were just issuing options. Vorik's mind raced through every possibility, every tactical retreat, every last-ditch defense they could mount. Nothing mattered. The planetary shields had been deactivated like someone flipping a switch. Their warships, the pride of the Zalari military, were now floating space debris, waiting for permission to function again. And the humans? They were just sitting there, waiting. No additional warnings, no show of force, just those words on the screen, and the timer counting down. We have to fight," one of the generals stammered, slamming his fist against the console. "We cannot simply roll over and—" The war room door hissed open before he could finish. Chancellor Ravin stepped in, looking like he had aged a century in a matter of hours. "You still think this is a war?" he asked quietly. His voice wasn't the usual grandiose tone of a ruler addressing his subordinates. It was the voice of a man staring into the abyss and realizing the abyss was about to press Control-Alt-Delete on his entire species. "Sir, we must at least try—" Try what?" Ravin interrupted, his tone sharp now. "Have you been watching the same footage I have? There are no explosions, no war cries, no resistance." His eyes darkened. "Because there is no war, there is only consequence." The general swallowed hard, hands balling into fists. The truth was too heavy to fight. "What do we do then?" someone else whispered. Ravin turned to Vorik. The one man who had spent his entire life preparing for war was now the one they needed to navigate something far worse. Survival. "The relocation," Vorik muttered. "It's the only option." The room tensed, the weight of those words sinking into every single being present. Surrender wasn't the right word. This was submission, a forced eviction from their own home, their empire, their legacy. "Prepare the official message," Ravin ordered, voice flat. "Let them know we accept." The communications officer hesitated, as if the very act of sending that message would make it real. Then, finally, he keyed it in. Message sent. There was no reply, no acknowledgement, no gloating response from the humans. Just silence. And then, like clockwork, the human ships began moving. Not to fire, not to escort prisoners, but to organize. They herded the Zalari people, directing them toward massive transport ships that hadn't existed in any known database before this moment. Within minutes, planetary control was no longer in Zalari hands. The humans didn't march troops into the cities. They didn't seize control of government buildings. They didn't need to. Entire city grids powered down on command. Starports locked down, forcing every Zalari to board the transports. They were being deleted in real time. Ravin stood at the war room window, watching the sky darken as more and more of their kind were ferried away. Not prisoners, not slaves, just removed. "Where are they taking us?" someone finally dared to ask. The reply came from a text update across every remaining operational screen. "Relocation in progress. No access to previous territories permitted. Your civilization has been archived." The message was clear. The Zalari didn't exist anymore, not in any way that mattered. The galaxy, The galaxy had moved on without them. The Zilari were gone, not in the way civilizations usually fell, not through conquest, not through rebellion, not even through some grand, cataclysmic final stand. They had simply been removed. The relocation ships had departed in complete silence, carrying the last remnants of a once mighty empire to a destination only the humans knew. And no one would ever hear from them again. For the rest of the galaxy, the message had been received loud and clear. Every major power, every ruling council, every species, with even a remote grasp of cause and effect, had watched the systematic dismantling of the Zilari in real time. No war, no negotiations, no mercy, just consequences. In the Galactic Council chamber, an emergency summit had been called, not to discuss retaliation, because nobody was that stupid anymore, but to figure out what the hell they were supposed to do now. The chamber was packed with representatives from every major species, all of them shifting uncomfortably, casting nervous glances at the lone figure standing in the center of the room. A human. He wasn't in armor. He wasn't surrounded by an escort. He wasn't making demands. He was just standing there, watching, waiting. Like a man who knew, with absolute certainty, that no one in the room had the authority to challenge him. The council chair, an old, weary diplomat whose species had survived countless wars through sheer avoidance of conflict, cleared his throat. "We recognize humanity's grievances," he began carefully, voice strained, "but we must ask, what happens next?" The human smiled, not a pleasant smile, not a cruel one either, just knowing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple data chip, setting it down on the central table. "What happens next," he said, voice calm, "is up to you." The council chair hesitated. "And this?" The human tapped the chip. A record of what happened to the Zilari. Every step, every action, every decision that led to their removal. A long pause. No one moved to take it. The implications were crystal clear. This wasn't a gift. It was a warning, a manual, a step-by-step guide to extinction. The silence stretched. The council chair finally exhaled, nodding slowly. "We understand." The human gave a small, satisfied nod. "Good." Without another word, he turned and walked away, exiting the chamber without looking back. No one tried to stop him. No one dared. And as the doors slid shut behind him, every species in that room knew one thing with absolute certainty. There would never be another war against humanity. Because war with humans wasn't war. It was a deletion. The aftermath of the Zilari's erasure rippled through the galaxy like a slow-moving shockwave, silent, unstoppable, final. The humans had given no further statements, made no further demands. They didn't need to. The point had been made, loudly. Entire civilizations, once bloated with arrogance, now scrambled to revise centuries of doctrine, rewriting military strategies that no longer applied. What was the point of fortresses when they could simply be turned off? What was the point of war when the enemy didn't fight, just removed? The most advanced fleets in the galaxy, built over generations, forged through endless conflicts, were nothing more than expensive decorations now. What use was a warship when the humans could switch it off with the press of a button? What was the point of an empire when a single mistake could make it disappear? The Zilari had been an example, a live demonstration, and the galaxy had taken notes. But the real fear, the real nightmare? No one knew where the humans had come from. No one knew how they had rebuilt, how they had evolved, how they had learned to do what they did. Humanity had spent 2,500 years in the dark, quietly constructing something vast, something unknowable. And now they were here, not demanding power, not expanding their borders, not seeking conquest. They had no interest in ruling. They didn't want planets. They didn't want trade agreements. They wanted something far, far worse. They wanted control, not overt, not loud, not in the traditional way, just the certainty that no one, ever again, would threaten their existence. And so the silence spread, an unnatural peace, a peace built on absolute, suffocating fear. Not because the humans were vengeful, not because they were cruel, but because they didn't need to be. They had already won. The Galactic Council convened emergency protocols, measures to prevent another incident, safeguards to ensure no species would ever be foolish enough to test the boundaries again. Trade pacts were rewritten, military alliances were dissolved. Everything was recalibrated to accommodate the unspoken truth that had now become law. You do not provoke humanity. You do not test them. You do not even think about war. The council chair, weary beyond words, stared out at the star-filled void through his private chamber's viewport. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of their sensors, beyond the edge of mapped space, the humans were watching, not governing, not expanding, just watching. And as he shut his eyes, exhaling the last remnants of his old world arrogance, he realized something. The galaxy hadn't achieved peace. It had been put on probation. The silence held. For years, decades, no wars, no territorial disputes, no ambitious empires trying to expand beyond their means. The galactic economy stabilized, piracy plummeted, and even the most war-hungry species suddenly found themselves advocating for diplomacy. Not because they had changed, not because they wanted peace, but because they were terrified. Every civilization, every ruling council, every warlord who had once dreamed of conquest now had the same recurring nightmare, a fleet appearing from the void, ships without insignias, without broadcasts, without warning, a silent execution. Because that's what humanity had become, a force beyond war, a power beyond politics, not rulers, not conquerors, a failsafe, a final, absolute deterrent. No one wanted to be the next Zalari. No one even wanted to know what would happen if humanity ever truly got angry. And so, the galaxy adapted. Slowly, the fear of total annihilation became something else: respect. Civilizations flourished under a new unspoken agreement. The wars of old became political maneuvering instead of military engagements. The death tolls shrank. The need for planetary defenses vanished. Entire industries were forced to pivot away from weapons manufacturing. War was no longer profitable, because war was no longer an option. The council, once a corrupt mess of self-serving bureaucrats, became something new, something functional, because the alternative was unthinkable. But the real question, where were the humans? The fleets that had erased these Zalari had never been seen again. No military installations, no colonies, no diplomatic envoys. Humanity had left one message, one simple, unambiguous statement of absolute power, and then they had disappeared. No one knew where they went. No one dared to look. And yet, there were whispers, rumors, fleeting signals detected in the farthest reaches of the void. Some believed humanity had hidden themselves away in an unknown sector of space, watching, waiting. Others thought they had transcended, becoming something beyond mere organic life. The most unsettling theory? That they had never left, that they were still here, still listening, still deciding who, if anyone, would ever be foolish enough to warrant their attention again. And so, the galaxy moved forward, not in peace, not in prosperity, but in careful, deliberate obedience to a law that no one had written, but everyone understood. Do not provoke humanity. Do not threaten their existence. Do not make them come back. The galaxy never forgot. No one spoke of it openly. There were no public records, no official accounts, no government statements. But the lesson had been burned into the collective memory of every species that had witnessed it. Humanity had become a myth, a warning whispered to new leaders, a bedtime story told to young strategists who dreamed too big. There were no second chances, no negotiations, just consequences. And yet, rumors persisted. Stories of ships vanishing without a trace, of warlords who had grown too bold, too ambitious, only to disappear overnight. A rogue fleet, a hidden faction, the last remnants of humanity's unstoppable force. No one knew what was real, but everyone feared it. The most paranoid governments devoted entire intelligence divisions to tracking ghost signals in the void. The most powerful military empires constantly reinforced their defenses against threats that weren't even confirmed to exist. And those who ruled from their comfortable council chambers, they never spoke of the event that had changed the course of galactic history, but they never, ever repeated the mistake. Because if the myths were true, if humanity had survived in the shadows, then one thing was certain. They were still watching, still waiting. And should anyone be foolish enough to provoke them again, they wouldn't just retaliate. They would finish what they started. Centuries passed, and the galaxy moved on. At least, that's what the bureaucrats told themselves. Empires rose and fell, wars were waged over trivial nonsense, and the great political machine churned forward, pretending that history wouldn't repeat itself. The Galactic Council became bloated, drunk on its own self-importance, filled with self-congratulatory diplomats who had never known real fear. And then, because history has a cruel sense of humor, someone got stupid. A minor power, the Terran sovereignty, barely a blip on the galactic stage, made the mistake of assuming the stories were just that, stories. They found an old wreck floating in the void, something ancient, something human, and instead of cataloging it and moving on like any sane civilization, they decided to tinker, to reverse engineer, to claim the remains of a species that had once torn through the stars like an unstoppable force of nature. The Council didn't intervene. They laughed. They watched. Let them waste their time, the Chancellor had scoffed. Humanity is a myth, dead and gone. And then, exactly one standard cycle later, the Terran homeworld went dark. No distress calls, no debris, no signs of battle, just gone. Like someone had flipped a switch and deleted it from existence. The Council lost their minds. Entire fleets were mobilized. Investigators were sent to the system, and what they found sent a cold, gut-wrenching terror through every species in the room. The planet was still there, technically. But the infrastructure, the cities, the billions of lives, erased. There was no crater, no ruins, no shattered remnants of orbital defenses, just an eerily perfect, untouched world, as if it had never been inhabited in the first place. And on every single screen, burned into every data terminal, was a simple message. You were warned. The Council chamber descended into chaos. Every species with a functional survival instinct immediately began purging their databases of anything remotely connected to humanity. Archives were erased, research stations abandoned, entire scientific teams who had even thought about poking at human remains were quietly retired. But it was too late, because the Terran had gotten greedy. The wreck they found, it wasn't just a ship. It had been broadcasting, a beacon, a distress signal, a long-dead call to the void that had finally been answered. And the ones who had answered, they weren't here to negotiate. They weren't here to talk. The myths had been right. The ghosts in the void had been watching, and now they were awake. The Council scrambled. Emergency meetings were held, alliances were tested, and military fleets were repositioned in a desperate attempt to brace for the unknown. Because that's what it was, unknown. No one had seen the ones responsible for the Terrans' disappearance. No fleets had been spotted, no broadcasts demanding surrender, no ultimatums issued. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes lesser civilizations collapse under their own paranoia. Then, exactly 7 days after the Terran homeworld went dark, the first confirmed sighting hit the feeds. A Council deep space surveillance outpost, one of the most secure installations in the galaxy, sent out a high-priority distress signal. It lasted exactly 12 seconds before being abruptly cut off. The footage recovered from its black box played in front of the assembled leaders, and for the first time in history, an entire room of galactic politicians stopped talking. The feed was grainy, distorted, but what it showed was clear enough. They were here. Ships. Human ships. No sleek, elegant designs like the Council fleets. No ostentatious displays of wealth and technological prowess. These things were brutal. Monolithic slabs of reinforced alloy, matte black hulls built for function over form, bristling with weapons that didn't look designed so much as built to delete things from reality itself. And the way they moved, that was the worst part. They didn't fly in formation like a navy. They didn't maneuver with the precise elegance of a disciplined fleet. They stalked. Each vessel moved independently, adjusting in ways that made no tactical sense, until you realized they were hunting, testing defenses, searching for weaknesses. The feed jumped as the outpost's automated defenses went live. Hundreds of turrets, missile arrays, and planetary shields activated in unison, an impenetrable wall of countermeasures designed to repel an entire invasion force. The human ships didn't even break formation. They just turned it off. No explosions, no dramatic firefight, just a silent, effortless disassembly of the station's systems, as if reality itself had decided it no longer worked. The last frame of the transmission was the outpost commander, standing in stunned horror as every single console around him shut down at once. Then, static. The council chamber erupted. Some demanded immediate surrender, others called for full mobilization. A few particularly stupid diplomats suggested talking to them, as if that had ever worked before. But then, as the shouting reached a fever pitch, a new transmission came through. No encryption, no security clearance required. Every screen in the chamber flickered, and the air grew thick with the weight of something that had been waiting a long, long time for this moment. The figure on screen was human, definitively human. And worse, he was calm, not angry, not vengeful, just certain. "We warned you," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "You should have listened." And then he sent the coordinates, not for another attack, not for another warning shot, for the Council's homeworld. The room went silent, because for the first time in their long, arrogant history, they realized they weren't in control anymore. The Council chamber descended into absolute chaos. Leaders who had once prided themselves on their unshakable authority now looked like cornered prey, their elaborate robes and ceremonial sashes doing nothing to mask the sheer panic in their eyes. The transmission had been brief, but the meaning was clear. They weren't dealing with a rogue faction, a forgotten colony, or some vengeful remnants of a species they thought extinct. No, this was all of them. Humanity had survived, grown, and evolved into something that no longer asked for a seat at the table. They were the table now, and they were flipping it over. The Chancellor's voice barely held together as he turned to his military advisor. "How long do we have?" The officer's pale, trembling fingers tapped desperately at a holographic console, running calculations that looked increasingly grim with each passing second. Based on their previous movements, hours, maybe less. "Impossible!" a Zalari diplomat shrieked, his crest flattened in horror. "Our homeworld is fortified. We have orbital defenses. We have—" The feed cut in again. No warning, no encryption, just him. The same human, same cold, unwavering expression. "We see your defenses," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a hammer about to fall, "and we don't care." The feed cut again. And then, the first reports started coming in. The defenses were failing. Not destroyed, not overwhelmed, just failing. Shields powered down like someone had flipped a switch. Weapons went inert, their targeting systems locking onto empty space. The most advanced warships in the Council's fleet sat dead in the void, powerless against an enemy they still couldn't even see. The Councilors stared at the screens in horror as entire defense platforms shut off in real time, their operators frantically trying and failing to regain control. This can't be happening," someone whispered. The last layer of planetary shields flickered, then disappeared, and then the sky opened up. They didn't come in waves. They didn't descend in some grand theatrical display of conquest. They simply arrived, their massive ships blotting out the stars like an approaching storm. The ground shook as dropships detached, descending with a silence that was somehow worse than any explosion. There was no bombarding the capital, no indiscriminate destruction. The humans weren't here to destroy. They were here to demonstrate. A new feed flickered to life, ground level. The Councilors collectively flinched as they saw them. Human soldiers moving with an eerie practiced efficiency, stepping over barricades that had once been considered impenetrable. They weren't running. They weren't even rushing. They moved with the quiet, absolute certainty of an executioner approaching the condemned. A panicked security official turned to his commander. "Mobilize the planetary guard. We still have forces on the ground." "No." The commander cut in, voice hollow. "We had forces on the ground." The feed zoomed in, showing the capital's primary defense barracks. The doors had been opened, not breached, opened, and inside, Council soldiers standing still. weapons at their sides, expressions blank. The human soldiers moved past them without a second glance. No restraints, no bloodshed, just absolute compliance. Why aren't they fighting? A counselor stammered. A grim realization settled over the room like a shroud. They didn't need to. Humanity hadn't just broken their defenses, they'd broken their will. And then, in the heart of the capital, where the council's most powerful leaders had once ruled unchallenged, a single message appeared on every screen, every console, every data feed across the planet. Negotiations are over. You work for us now. Panic turned to something worse. Resignation. The council chamber, once the seat of the most powerful governing body in the galaxy, now felt like a tomb. No shouting. No desperate calls for action. Just the suffocating silence of people realizing their fates had been rewritten without their consent. A single human soldier walked through the grand hall of the capital, helmet under one arm, moving with the casual authority of someone who already owned the place. No guards tried to stop him. No alarms blared. It was done. The counselors barely flinched when the chamber doors slid open. No blast, no forced entry, just a quiet invitation that made their stomachs churn. And then he walked in. The same human who had sent the first message. The same human who had made them understand what was happening before it even began. Commander Elias Voss. He didn't wear extravagant armor. No medals adorned his chest. Just a dark uniform that made his presence all the more unsettling. He scanned the room, not with hostility, just cold, clinical analysis. I expected more resistance, he mused. His voice wasn't mocking. It was simply noting a fact. Didn't think you'd all fold this fast. The Zellery Chancellor, once one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, swallowed hard. His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat. We have no means of resisting. Voss nodded approvingly, as if they'd all passed some kind of test. Good, then let's talk about terms. The words sent a shiver through the chamber. They had imagined many possible outcomes to this conflict, but none had considered that humanity might not even want revenge. Not in the traditional sense. You wiped us out once, Voss continued, or thought you did. So here's the deal. We don't wipe you out. We don't enslave you. We don't dismantle your species and scatter you across the stars. He paused, letting the weight of that unspoken alternative settle into their bones. But you're not in charge anymore. The High Council, once an entity that dictated the fate of entire civilizations, was now reduced to trembling figures awaiting their new hierarchy. Voss gestured, and behind him, a new set of screens flickered to life, displaying a structured list of changes. Galactic authority transferred, military disarmament, economic restructuring, re-education programs. The Chancellor's mouth opened, then closed. He wanted to argue. He wanted to demand something in return, but he knew, they all knew, that humanity wasn't asking. You'll adapt, Voss said simply. Or you won't. We don't particularly care. What matters is that you understand. His gaze hardened, that unshakable certainty returning. We don't start wars, we end them, and we never allow the same mistake twice. The last words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Now, he said, turning toward the massive council insignia carved into the wall. With a lazy flick of his wrist, the screens rewrote it. The new insignia, the new ruling body, the Terror Ascendancy. The change was instant, inevitable, permanent. Voss turned back to the silent, shattered council, hands clasped behind his back. Welcome to the new order, he said, voice calm. Try not to screw it up again. The silence in the chamber was deafening. The weight of the moment crushed down on the council members like a collapsing star. No one dared speak, not even the Chancellor, whose authority had been erased with a single sentence. The screens flickered again, the new insignia of the Terror Ascendancy glaring down at them, an undeniable statement of dominance. Voss took his time, letting the reality settle in. No one protested, no one pleaded. The moment they had sat in this room and accepted their powerlessness, they had sealed their own fate. A slow exhale from the Chancellor was the only sound in the room. You're not going to kill us? The words barely made it past his lips, and he almost seemed afraid of the answer. Voss raised a brow, as if the very question was mildly insulting. If we wanted you dead, you wouldn't have had time to ask. He took a step forward, boots echoing in the vast chamber. No, killing you would be a waste. We'd rather do something far worse. His head tilted slightly, studying them like a scientist observing an outdated, malfunctioning machine. We're going to let you watch. A murmur rippled through the council members, but none had the nerve to speak outright. What does that mean? One of the lesser diplomats asked hesitantly. Voss gestured to the screens. The Zalari Empire is done, finished. Your species will survive, but as a footnote, a relic of a time before you understood your place. You will live to see humanity reshape the stars. You will remember the moment you lost everything. And when your descendants look up at the galactic power structure and see nothing but our insignia, they will ask, what happened? He smiled, a slow, deliberate expression, devoid of warmth. And you will have to tell them. The Chancellor visibly flinched, fingers tightening into a fist, before he forced himself to loosen them. He knew there was no winning this, no bargaining, no plea that would sway them. And what happens to us now? Voss exhaled, the momentary flicker of amusement vanishing as he returned to the cold, calculated executioner that had ripped apart an empire without firing a single shot. Your power is gone. Your fleets, your weapons, your strongholds, all under our control. Your systems will be integrated into the Terror Ascendancy, and you will follow our laws. His gaze swept the room, lingering on each and every council member. Your people will be given a choice, assimilate or fade into irrelevance. The words struck like a hammer, the final nail in the coffin of a once mighty empire. Some of the council members looked like they wanted to protest, to argue, to cling to whatever shred of dignity they had left. But they didn't. They couldn't, because the cold, inescapable truth was standing before them, arms crossed, watching them accept their own defeat. So that's it, the Chancellor muttered, voice hollow. We exist at your mercy now. Voss leaned in slightly, just enough to loom over the broken leader. No, he said, voice quieter but infinitely more menacing. You exist because we allow it. The transmission cut, the screens flickered off, and the chamber was left in silence. The humans were done speaking, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The council sat frozen in place, as if daring to move would somehow cement their fate even further. The Chancellor, once the most powerful individual in the known galaxy, now looked like a condemned man awaiting his execution. And in many ways, he was. Just not in the way he had feared. There would be no last stands, no heroic final words, no desperate attempts to claw back power. No, their fate had already been sealed. It was in the silence, in the way their once proud banners had been replaced by the cold, minimalist insignia of the Terror Ascendancy. It was in the way the humans hadn't even raised their weapons, because they had never needed to. Voss had given them their choices, assimilate or fade into irrelevance, and they knew there had only ever been one answer. The Chancellor finally let out a breath, one that carried the last remnants of his defiance with it. We submit, he whispered. The words tasted like ash. Voss didn't react, didn't gloat, didn't so much as blink. There was no satisfaction in this for him, no triumph. He had come with a task, and now it was completed. Wise decision, he said, turning away. The council members looked at each other, some still in shock, some already thinking ahead, calculating how they could survive under their new overlords. But they all knew there would be no schemes, no slow, patient rebellion. That was the old way. Humanity had ended it in a single, brutal campaign of precision and efficiency. What happens now? The Chancellor finally asked, more out of obligation than hope. Now? Voss glanced over his shoulder. Now, you adapt. The chamber was silent as Voss stepped toward the massive viewport overlooking the former Zalari homeworld. It was no longer a capital of power, no longer the seat of an empire. It was just another world now, one among many, orbiting under the shadow of humanity's dominion. The council members sat rigid, their expressions ranging from barely contained panic to quiet, exhausted acceptance. The war wasn't lost today. It had been lost the moment humanity returned. No fleet engagements, no drawn-out campaigns, just a methodical dismantling of everything the Zilari had built, one system at a time, like a vengeful god, unwriting the mistakes of history. "You don't understand," the Chancellor finally said, forcing the words past the dry lump in his throat. We're not like you." A wry, humorless smirk tugged at the corner of Voss's mouth. "I know." The Chancellor flinched. "You're predators," he continued, his voice growing more desperate. "Your kind has spent millennia perfecting the art of survival, of adaptation, of warfare, but we—" His breath hitched. "We're politicians, bureaucrats. We build civilizations, trade networks, alliances. We don't know how to—" "Then learn," Voss interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Because the old way is gone. Your systems, your infrastructure, your so-called alliances, they all crumbled the second you realized that your rule was propped up by nothing but the assumption that no one could challenge you. And now?" Voss turned, staring down the Chancellor with the cold detachment of someone who had already moved past this conversation. "Now, the ones you once dismissed as extinct are the ones writing the next chapter of this galaxy. Adapt, or become another footnote." The Chancellor's hands clenched into trembling fists. "And if we refuse?" A small, sharp laugh escaped Voss, not cruel, not mocking, just a simple acknowledgement of how utterly out of options the Zilari were. "Then you'll fade. No invasion, no war crimes, no massacres. We don't need to destroy you." He leaned forward, voice calm, matter-of-fact. "We'll just make you irrelevant." The words landed harder than any weapon could. There would be no noble rebellion, no desperate final stand to be remembered in the annals of history. Just a slow, inevitable decline into obscurity, while the rest of the galaxy moved forward without them. It was the ultimate insult, a fate worse than destruction. The Chancellor swallowed hard, his gaze flickering toward the other council members, searching for some spark of resistance. He found none, only resignation. "What do you want from us?" The question wasn't defiant anymore. It was surrender. Voss exhaled through his nose, as if the theatrics of the moment bored him. "Cooperation?" The Chancellor nearly laughed. "You expect us to simply fall in line?" Voss tilted his head slightly. "You already have." A cold realization swept through the chamber. He was right. They had surrendered the moment they accepted that fighting back wasn't an option. They had surrendered the moment they sat in this room, waiting for their fate to be handed to them. The war hadn't ended today. It had never even begun. The humans had simply walked in and taken what they wanted, and no one had been able to stop them. The Chancellor let out a shuddering breath, lowering his head in defeat. "What do we do now?" Voss didn't answer immediately. He simply turned back toward the viewport, gazing out over the Zilari homeworld. His home, now. "Now," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone in the room, "we rebuild." The silence that followed wasn't filled with fear, or anger, or even despair. It was something worse. It was acceptance. If you enjoyed drifting through this tale, join us for more. A simple subscription will ensure there's always a story waiting for you at bedtime.